Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Kayla. This is my cat, Tuna. This is my other cat, Mojo, and we are here to talk to you about all things BPD. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to stick around. So a question that I have gotten a few times is regarding the connection or similarities and differences between Autism Spectrum Disorder, or known as ASD, and borderline personality disorder. So there was a study conducted in 2019, which I will link in the show notes down below, that showed that around 68% of those with ASD actually met the diagnostic criteria for at least one personality disorder. So we can see that to some extent there is some overlapping traits or features in between ASD and some of the personality disorders. So what do those traits actually look like? What does that mean? What is the likelihood of having both? What are the differences? These are all the questions that I will be answering for you today. So before diving into those questions that I was just mentioning, let's take a minute to define and explain the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. So this is a disorder found within the DSM, just like BPD. And I'm just going to read my notes because I don't want to miss anything, but some of the symptoms associated with ASD is things like difficulty in social communication and interaction. So we could have things like difficulty making eye contact with people, difficulty with having back and forth conversations. So maybe you ask a question and it's just answered with no asking you how you're doing. So difficulty with maintaining the eye contact, difficulty with maintaining this back and forth conversation. They might have different body language that they use. They're not the most susceptible to reading the body language of others. So maybe someone is mad or being sarcastic and this will just go over their head. Other things that we also see is sometimes we see an absence in interest in peers. So we could see people with ASD that are kind of just good doing their own thing. I also want to mention that this is a spectrum, right? Within the name we have Autism Spectrum Disorder, meaning that the variety of symptoms and how they actually present themselves is very individual. It's very different from person to person, just like BPD. Okay, so just important to keep this in mind. While I am reading the symptoms, I also do not want to generalize to say that this is the way that ASD presents itself in every single person. It's really not true. And we also see this in women who have this disorder. The way it presents itself is very different. And this is one of the reasons why it's actually hard or more difficult to get diagnosed with ASD as a woman. Something else that we would see would be restrictive, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities. So what I mean by this is being inflexible. So when they have a routine, they're inflexible. It's really hard to change, to bring new things into their day-to-day life, and this can lead into a crisis mode. We sometimes see children, for example, with ASD that when you take them out of their routine, if you're going on a trip, their behavior or mood might be more all over the place because they have a really hard time changing and adapting to change. The last thing I'm going to mention as one of the symptoms is this hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory output. So what I mean by this, they might be more sensitive to sounds, sights, smells, etc., or they might be under-reactive to those things. BPD, on the other hand, is a personality disorder, so really important to know that ASD is not a personality disorder. And BPD, we have 9 symptoms. If you're still not sure what that is, I'm just going to link my previous video that really details what it is just up above here. But essentially, if I could really define it, is we see a lot of patterns as unstable relationships, unstable moods, dysregulated emotions, impulsivity, angry outbursts. Those are the classical things that we associate with BPD. So when it comes to these two disorders, we actually see a lot of differences, and we do not see these listed as a differential diagnosis for one another within the DSM. So usually in the DSM, when we have a disorder, we have listed other possible disorders which are similar to the one that we're looking at. We don't see this with BPD and ASD. But what we do see is an overlap of traits, especially when it comes to the cognitive ones, specifically this difficulty with reading emotions. And so while we do not see these as a differential diagnosis, we do see sometimes an overlapping comorbidity with BPD and ASD. So some of the similarities that we might see is, like I mentioned, this difficulty on the more cognitive level of reading emotions of others. So with BPD, what often happens is that because we are hypersensitive as people, we're also hypersensitive to perceiving emotions of others, while often we project our own mood onto the situation that's actually happening. So we might misinterpret someone's sarcastic remark or whatever as them actually being angry towards us because we are hypersensitive to this criticism, to this abandonment. While we also see this with ASD, so them being not the most attuned to social cues, to reading other people's emotions, this is a similarity. With both disorders, we also see the same sensitivity to abandonment. What I mean by this is that with BPD and ASD, we see this typical pattern of getting attached very intensely to a few specific people and having an intense fear of change. This is the same in both disorders. It might not be triggered for the same exact reasons, but when we see the patterns playing out, they might look or be very, very similar. Two other things that we see is identity disturbances. So we see this fluctuation in the sense of self, this exploration of different sexual preferences and genders. We see this very commonly in both disorders. And the last thing would be this affective instability. This is the core thing that we see with BPD, the dysregulated emotions. We also see this very frequently in those with ASD because, once again, might not be for the same reasons. If you're being overly stimulated, because this is one of the traits of having ASD, by sensory outputs, and in turn you're having dysregulated moods, whereas BPD might have dysregulated moods because your fear of abandonment is driving you, but the moods are dysregulated, and this is regardless of the reasoning, this is a similarity on the face level of what people are seeing. Okay, so now we talked about the similarities. What about the differences? The best way to compare differences in between both disorders is to use the Big Five personality model, or the 5-factor model. So we have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or the acronym for this is OCEAN. I blanked out 1 second because I was trying to remember the acronym as I was saying the 5 personality traits within it. But when we compare both BPD and ASD, what we tend to see is those with BPD tend to be higher in openness, they tend to be higher in extroversion, they also tend to be higher in neuroticism and lower in conscientiousness. Where we see similarities in both disorders, we see that both of them tend to be higher on agreeableness. They also tend to be higher on callousness. So callousness is a subtype of one of the Big Five. And callousness essentially is referring back to this thing of being not perceptive, not sensitive to other people's emotions, not being able to read the room, really sometimes even answering in a kind of like rough and cold way to how people are expressing themselves to you. So those would be the similarities and differences based on the 5-factor model. I will link the study down below because it's very interesting. So if you're curious and you want to take the time to read up on it, those will be just in the show notes as I always put them. Now, as I had already mentioned, it is important to note that while the symptoms may look the same on a face level, usually the triggers or motivations behind the actions are quite different in both disorders, where we have this fear of abandonment, and in turn we have this dysregulated mood coming up, being impulsive. With ASD, we might have this difficulty with being hyper-reactive to sensory output, and in turn we see the face level symptom of being really dysregulated, being inflexible with change. And so for you specifically, if you're wondering, well, do I have BPD? Do I have ASD? Do I have traits from both? It's important to not just stop to look at the symptoms, but really to examine yourself, to ask yourself, what is the driving factor? Am I getting overwhelmed because there's loud music playing, or I'm in a new environment and it's scary and I don't have the same routine? Then you might look at ASD. Are you getting triggered because someone is canceling plans on you, or you're scared that they're going to leave you? There's life changes happening that's triggering this fear of abandonment. So with all disorders, we always want to look at the reasoning behind the symptoms, because if we're just trying to mitigate the symptoms, we're not getting at the root of what is causing those things. And when we don't have the awareness, it's really hard to know what to do to move forward. There's still so much to learn about these two disorders, both separately and jointly, because we do have overlapping traits and overlapping symptoms, and you might be a person that suffers from both disorders. And so the best way to really help to spread awareness is to talk about it. And you can share my videos, you can like them, you can subscribe to my channel. The more that we subscribe, the more that we share my videos, the bigger that our community grows, and the more that we help to spread awareness about not only BPD, but about other misunderstood disorders out there. I'm curious to know if some of you have been diagnosed with both disorders and kind of tips and tricks on what you do to manage both the symptoms, because I know that they're very different and the way to go about treating them are different as well. So if that's you, then leave a comment down below, because it will help me out. It will help the other people in our community to get more informed. And I always read and respond to every comment. So please don't be shy and do that. On that note, I wish you all an amazing rest of your week, and I will see you back here next Monday for another episode of On the Line.